This short video explains how English as mentally represented in learners and users is associated with two types of memory system called procedural memory and declarative memory. It's based on the theory developed by Michael Ullman, but skirts over a lot of the details. Here's a representation of the left hemisphere of the human brain, showing the four main sections called lobes. Neuroscientists have identified the two types of memory with two physically distinct groups of brain structures in and beneath the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. Procedural memory, associated with the frontal lobe, is where we store and access unconscious knowledge about how to do things, especially activities and functions involving sequences, including physical processes like getting on and starting to ride a bicycle, or purely mental ones like adding up a list of numbers. Declarative memory, associated with the temporal lobe, is where we store and access knowledge that things are the case or have happened, a lot of which is conscious, like the name of your best friend and the circumstances in which you last met. Information in procedural memory is acquired through repeated practice and is automatically accessed when we need to do the things we do, whereas some information in declarative memory is open to awareness and can be deliberately learned. Take, for example, changing gear in a car with manual transmission. You start learning how to do this by deliberately studying the way the gear lever needs to be moved, perhaps using a visual schema which graphically represents the declarative knowledge that each position represents a different gear. After a lot of practice, the operation of the gear lever becomes automatic, and you change gears without being aware of it, tapping into procedural knowledge about how to operate the system. Think back to the last time you drove a car or rode a bike. Were you thinking about operating the gears or the pedals, or was it all just happening as you concentrated on the road in front of you? Crucially, the knowledge you end up relying on to drive your car or ride your bike is not the relevant learned knowledge you have in declarative memory, but a mentally distinct kind of knowledge you acquired alongside it in procedural memory through repeated practice. Hence, as a driver, you may not change gears exactly the way your driving instructor taught you. So how does this relate to people developing linguistic knowledge of English? Let's take L1 English first. Where does it start? Well, infants acquire their language knowledge through repeated exposure and use with people around them. They're completely unaware of the system they're using. They just automatically and unconsciously start to speak and understand, gradually constructing a mental grammar and mental lexicon which match those of the people they interact with. So child language acquisition starts with knowledge represented in procedural memory. It is English that is naturally, unconsciously acquired, rather than deliberately learned. It's derived from the regularities that each infant detects in the input they're exposed to in meaningful interactions. For the vast majority of L1 users, including me, this isn't standard English, but rather a dialectal register which has grammatical features that are unstandardized. For example, I say things like, "Me and Rachel are going to the pub now," rather than the more proper "Rachel and I." Most people only come to have some conscious knowledge about their first language when they go to school. So, through the educational process, English-speaking children come to know about English as declarative knowledge through deliberate learning. But the English they come to have conscious knowledge of from teachers and classes is standard English, the so-called correct rules of English, regulations they are expected to abide by in their own speaking and especially writing. This knowledge will be deliberately accessed, so won't be as fluent as the procedural knowledge they acquired unconsciously at home. In fact, like other facts we learn, it can be difficult to access them when under pressure to perform, and many children will use standard English only laboriously. The two kinds of English knowledge will compete, and the naturally acquired unstandardized English of the home environment will normally win out, unless of course you carefully self-monitor, as I'm doing now. Okay, let's now consider L2 English development. Where does the process start? For most learners, it starts in a classroom with deliberate study. So the first knowledge of L2 English is stored in declarative memory and is consciously learned rather than being naturally and unconsciously acquired. Once there, accessing it for production and comprehension is usually very effortful, especially if learners are getting just a few hours of practice per week. Now, most teachers would probably agree that a key objective, for many the main one, is to help learners to be able to use English effortlessly and successfully for communication. SLA and TESOL scholars typically assert that this means the knowledge students learn needs to be automatized so that they can use it fluently. As you'll have guessed, this means developing procedural knowledge of English, of the kind children from English-speaking homes develop naturally. So, can declarative knowledge become procedural knowledge, as the automatization process requires? Well, Ullman, rightly, argues that it can't, at least not literally. Information doesn't physically move in the brain. What's learned in declarative memory will find an echo in procedural memory only on the basis of actual unconscious experience of meaningful input and use. It follows from this that over-insistence on accuracy in standard English is a problem. Learners are expected to develop knowledge of standard English from their teachers and textbooks, and their success as learners is assessed on tests which measure the extent to which they can perform according to fixed rules as regulations to be obeyed. The preoccupation with accuracy, then, reflects a monolithic orientation to English which values conformity over communicative effectiveness. Inevitably, though, learners are also experiencing English usage which exhibits all sorts of pluralithic forms, which conform, to a greater or lesser extent, with the rules of standard English. This usage comes from teachers, fellow students, TV programs, movies, and other non-native speakers in ELF contexts, both in person and online. Students are automatically analyzing this input and detecting regularities which won't conform fully to what they're taught. But it's this procedural knowledge that they'll actually use in communicative contexts. This knowledge will be shaped too by other factors, which will make it different from standard English, including transfer from the L1 and other languages they know, and automatic learning processes, like overgeneralization. What we're saying, then, is that all learners will develop a parallel system of English in procedural memory, which will be more accessible than their declarative knowledge. Because it's not derived solely from books and teachers, it will likely include all sorts of features that would be judged inaccurate or incorrect, despite how fluent and effective it makes them. This will be their own version of English, an idiolect, just like every native speaker has, part of their communicative repertoire and their identity. The critical point here is that this outcome can't be avoided. What learners are taught is not what they will come to know and use in any real communicative sense. And this isn't a bad thing. Surely we want our students to be making meaning effectively in practice, rather than just knowing how to pass tests on what English is supposed to be in theory. This insight is the very essence of the pluralistic view of English.